Welcome to Decoding the Conflict Mindset. I'm Dr. Deborah Dupri, host and founder of Decoding the Conflict Mindset. I strive to bring together, critical thought leaders who approach conflict from different directions. Today's guest speaker is Sam Ardery. Sam is a national mediator and has spoken from coast to coast on the subject of conflict. One of the things that I loved learning about him when we met at the National Academy of Distinguished Neutrals last year in Atlanta was that he himself has had a very interesting journey, having struggled with alcoholism, and then he actually got into mediation not by choice, but because he wanted to find out what those mediators were going to do to him as a litigator in the mediation process. So the lessons that Sam has learned over the years are phenomenal. One of the things that he focuses on today is that being right is really expensive and way overrated. So what's wrong with being right? So that's what we're going to take a look at. And one of the things you'll learn from Sam today is how to park it. Now, he has a very creative way of using park. You'll learn that as you listen to his interview today. So please join me, Sam Ardery. He teaches at negotiation at the Indiana University Maurer School of Law, and he's been distinguished as an outstanding faculty member. He's taught hundreds and hundreds of law students who now practice around the world. So you are getting one qualified and knowledgeable individual when it comes not only to litigation, but mediation. And again, being right is really expensive and overrated. So stay tuned, pass this on. Please let us know your responses to Sam's presentation. Let us know by chat, join us wherever you can, and pass it on. Share it to your communities. Thank you for joining us. Well, welcome everyone to Decoding the Conflict Mindset. Dr. Deborah Dupri, your host and lead speaker here. And I'm delighted to have here with me Sam Ardery. Welcome, Sam.
Glad to be here, Deborah. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm so intrigued about, your title, Being Right is Really Expensive and Way Overrated, coming from your background as a litigator and a mediator. And I guess, what drives that title? And we'll jump into some of the questions I have for you.
Well, I have found so many times in conflict, which is always what mediation is about, that people spend time fighting about what is right and they stop listening completely. I mean, they get so tied up in that. And what I found is if we just look at our general life circumstances, that being right is a driver, but it's not always a helpful one to us to get connected or to be productive or even maybe to move in the direction that we want. And one of the stories I think about is one with my wife and I, and we've been married just recently, married 40 years. And this has been several years, thank you. But there have been times when it was in doubt. And one of those times several years ago, we were standing in our living room and we're talking and we're standing up and arguing, which often means that I was talking a lot and not listening very well. And I noticed that she'd kind of gone quiet. And so I quieted down and she put her hands on her hips and she looked me in the eye and she said, "Sam, would you rather be right or would you rather be married?" And I did not answer very quickly, and she left the room before I could. Had I had a moment to reflect, there was no question that being right wasn't nearly as important as our marriage. But I think whatever the brain chemistry is, or that charge of being right, or even the fear of the vulnerability of not being right, led me to push forward with this point that I can't even remember the topic, but it was important enough to me in that moment that I was making her miserable. And I think that being right piece plays out so often. And we fight so hard to be right that we can lose the forest for the trees. And so that's really where the title comes from.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you sharing that story, and it illustrates it so very well. Yes, I can really resonate with what you just said, because I know, well, I do a lot around communication styles, and as sort of a foundation to help people understand who they are as well as understand others. And there is a particular communication style that tends to very much value being right. and they will argue ad nauseum to prove their point. And so I'll oftentimes say, well, you think you're right. There's always a different perspective, right?
And rarely do we put that in context, though, because in those moments, I mean, and the way I think about it is there was a philosopher I was talking to one time, and I wish I could remember which other philosopher said it, but he said, we all think we have just the right amount of common sense, right? I mean, it got you to where you are and me to where I am. And to the extent we're comfortable with whatever that place is, our common sense did a lot of that, but our common sense is not infallible. And what I deal with, and I've done about 5,000 mediations, every single person who comes into my office is there because something happened they didn't think would happen. Not 99%, 100% of them. And when they arrive, they still think they have the right amount of common sense. And they've often spent enormous amounts of money and time and often sweat and tears to get there because they've invested so deeply in that rightness. It's at least worth, and for me at least, the most helpful thing for me is often asking somebody else who's not involved, somebody who I will trust to be honest with me, even if they say, golly, Sam, you're being pretty unreasonable. You're being kind of intractable. Or, Sam, even if you're right, is this worth it? And the two questions I begin with everybody in a conflict is, and I think these are the most important two questions. One, is it worth it? And two, is it safe? Because if it's not worth it, and I've had, conversations, whether it's with one of my partners or it could be arguing about a ball game, and I'll realize, boy, the level of intensity or energy we're putting into this is way beyond anything it's worth. Now, if you decide it's worth it, then you've got to decide if it's safe. And I think that the disconnect for us there is because almost all conflict is uncomfortable, that we will equate discomfort with unsafe. And it pulling those two apart, I think, is important, because it's easy for me to say, well, it's worth it, but golly, I'm uncomfortable, so it must be unsafe. And I think those are the harder, more nuanced questions to sort out.
Now, again, two excellent points there. Because as you said, people will invest a lot of time and energy and money into proving their point. And instead, for me, one thing I like to ask is that, well, let me really listen to where you're coming from and what can I learn from it, so I can in turn look at my position or my perspective differently. What can I gain by hearing you out? And oftentimes, like you say, people stop listening when they are so fixated on a particular point.
And even if we try to listen, what I find, and I talk to the deans at law schools, we teach advocacy, we talk about convincing and things like that. Well, all of those are about getting my point across. They're not about listening to yours and thinking what might be effective. And I teach negotiation, and I tell everyone, here is our starting point. If there's something you want somebody else to do, then the place to start is to try to figure out how to make it as easy as possible for them to do it. Now, that's not necessarily very interesting. It's not going to be the plot of a movie or a really exciting TV show. But if I spend some time thinking about how I can make it easy for them, I have for a moment at least stopped thinking about me and my position. And that's a place I think we could find a little bit more freedom for some creativity and imagination that doesn't come naturally when we're in the midst of that argument or trying to convince somebody of something.
Yes, excellent point. One of the things that I work a lot around the communication side of things as well, not just managing or mediating conflict. But one of the things I emphasize that it's important that we're mindful of how we come across, so that we can speak in ways that the other person can actually continue to listen to us. But if we get loud and boisterous, or name calling and judgment-filled adjectives, then people are going to stop listening with that kind of intensity. And like you said, it's one thing to be uncomfortable. It is another thing to be unsafe. And so, are we behaving in ways that actually make it unsafe beyond being uncomfortable?
Well, and among the ways I find easiest to start to find out how we appear to other people is to watch a recording of ourselves. And we will look differently and we will sound differently than we think we do. And it may be that we still think we're getting our points across. Who knows, one way or the other. But even that simple practice of saying, wow, I didn't think I said it like that, or wow, I didn't think I talked that quickly, Or, boy, I thought there were more pauses for me to let somebody else speak, and I'll realize there were none. And that again gives me, there's a concept I use that I may have mentioned before called PARC, PARC, which is when I feel that charge of conflict, and there almost always is some kind of a charge or at least some discomfort, it's a time for me to what I call PARC. And that's to pause, take a breath, simply pause, to assess, to reflect, and then to choose. And it's not my inclination when I feel like the lion's chasing me and I have that flight, freeze, fight response to do that. But rarely are we really being challenged in a way that we're not going to survive. And so that pause can put us in context to really take a look at that. The assess can look at the context. What's really going on here? Who am I involved with? What's been going on with me? Why am I maybe responding in a way that even I think is disproportionate to what's going on? Then I can reflect on both of those, and I can maybe make a better choice so I can respond instead of react. But if we do even one of those, we are way ahead of the game. I mean, think about how those conflict exchanges go for most of us, depending on, again, personalities, communication styles. Often one person is talking over the other. They may not even hear what's been said, or they hear it, but they're just behaving politely because they know they need to pause before they say whatever their point is. They really haven't heard anything that's going on. And I think it's hard. The example I use sometimes is Will Smith at the Oscars a couple of years ago, when Chris Rock's hosting and he says something that apparently insulted Will Smith, or something he said about his wife, and Will Smith runs up on stage and smacks Chris Rock in the face. And I was teaching at the university, and I came in right after we talked about PARC, and one of my students said, "Boy, Will Smith sure didn't park at the Oscars last week." But what I want to keep in mind is I am no better than Will Smith. I just don't have an audience of millions of people to see me on that day when I may have failed miserably. But in that moment, I don't know what was going through, what fear was kind of going through him, whether it was fear of losing face or his pride, or how he defended his family and all those other things. And he, I would argue, probably reacted instead of responded.
Right.
And before I criticize him too much for that, I just want to say I'm fully capable. And then we've got on the other end of that, Chris Rock, who had to have an adrenaline rush himself, this unscripted moment where somebody hits him physically, and yet he didn't respond in that moment. And even afterwards, for a long time, he didn't say much about it to anybody. He just stayed quiet and let it play out. And that was a longer pause. But golly, most of the things I find that work best in mediation and conflict and even negotiation are not the things that are most intuitive for us.
Excellent point. Yes. Yeah. One thing I like to share with people is that too often we don't pause, like you said, to really listen. And so I've got a phrase I say, to actively listen, it's giving someone our full attention. And it's not just what comes out of our mouth, it's what's going on in our head. And not everything that pops in our head needs to come out of our mouth. And because people are very, it's part of, like you said already, the drive to survive, the fight, flight, flee. And people naturally are very reactive and then defensive. They feel that they have to defend whatever they said. And I'll share with you, I had two conversations just yesterday that, one was with an attorney who was just saying, I was just asking a simple question and I was just getting all of this backlash, an explanation about blah, 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 blah. And it was just a really yes or no question, and then a little later, I was in a conversation with somebody, and I'd already been interrupted by the other person in the meeting, and it was like, that just went in a whole nother direction. That's not even where I was going. I was trying to clarify and summarize what was being said. So I was clear in my own mind, and yet she interrupted me. And so I was annoyed, and then she did it again. And then the other person, I was just trying to clarify a yes or no question is, so we're looking at two things here. And the first thing is for this, the second thing is for this. Instead of answering my question, I went off into a defensive response, a rationale of why we should do it. I said, well, that's not my question. I get why we're doing it. I just want to know, are we talking to, So it's good examples of how people weren't listening.
Well, and it can be really hard because if they haven't listened, or if what they heard is different than what I intended,
Mhm.
We've kind of got to draw down the energy in the room again. I mean, I'll frequently apologize when I don't think I've done anything wrong, but I'll apologize because it sounds like what I was intending to communicate was miscommunicated on my end. Here's what I was trying to do. It sounds like you want, and you want to go here, just so we've reframed what we're talking about. And that can get frustrating and difficult if people are paying a lot of money for a limited amount of time. There's kind of an agreed upon goal, but you find out there's another agenda that underlies it. And how we navigate those things can be extraordinarily nuanced.
Yes, yes, yes. And so it's important to have that kind of conversation about the misconversation, so to speak, and because you could be coming at things from two different places,
Right.
unintentionally.
Right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and when I get if sometimes I'm that person, somebody thinks they're asking me a simple question,
Mhm.
but I've got my own noise going on back here. And I'll start to respond defensively. And I've had to say to people sometimes, my guess is you didn't want me to respond this way, but I'm
Mhm.
so defensive right now, I don't know that I have the tools to answer your question.
Mhm.
And depending on the time frame we have available to us, or what the goals are, what the relationships are, I'm not saying I'm going to run away from what appears to be a more difficult question than you intended. What I'm
Mhm.
telling you is I don't think I have a productive way to answer it right now, not because of a problem with your question, but because I'm in such an agitated state. I simply don't have the tools. Now, that doesn't work every time, and it's not necessarily a tool as much as it's an honest statement of where I am. It's not putting
Yeah,
any blame on you at all.
yeah. No, I mean, I like to call that you're owning it. You're owning where you're
Yes.
coming from, and you're transparent enough to acknowledge that. And yeah, yeah. Too often people make it about the other person, and again, then that's where it feels unsafe because people feel like they're being attacked. And it's like, no, that's not where I'm trying to come from. Yeah, yeah. I like to quote Ian Percy, who has a saying, we tend to judge others by their behaviors, but we tend to justify our own by our intent.
Yep.
And so, yeah, and so that's where that dance of conflict can come into play. Then is that we give little sway to the other person in understanding where they're coming from, but we're very quick to put out where we're coming from, and again justify that. Yeah, yeah. I guess I'm curious. I mean, you give us an example of how you will manage yourself if you feel like you're getting charged up. Um, what do you recognize? How are you aware of when you might be feeling conflict yourself, and what can others learn from that?
I find that it's rare that I don't that I experience conflict and don't have some kind of a physical response to it.
Yeah.
And it may depend on the size of the conflict, but there is almost always some degree of discomfort or agitation. I mean, it can be just a little rumble in my stomach, or I'm feeling a little tension, or I find myself being irritated when there doesn't seem to be any reason for me to be irritated. My hand, and bigger conflicts, my hands will get sweaty, my heart rate will go up. I'll find a little catch in my throat. And I'll notice the difference in how relaxed the other person is and how agitated I am. And that gives me an idea that at least what I'm experiencing is different than what they're experiencing. And you've probably read Besser van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is really about trauma and things like that. But I think we try to divide things up as if it's binary. There's my brain, and then there's my emotions. And what I've learned is they are inseparable. It's why we feel so insulted if somebody says, "Okay, Sam, now I want you to set aside your emotions and be rational here." One, it's not possible, and two, somebody's insulting me because what they're really saying is, you're not being too emotional. You're being unreasonable. And if you would just do what I said and think the way I think, then we wouldn't have to have this conflict at all, or this argument at all, or this negotiation at all. So I think the physical part of it is vitally important, because I think otherwise we have a conversation like Patty and I had in our living room, where I wasn't even aware that I was that agitated because I was so unaware of my own body. I'm sure my heart rate was up. My face was probably flushed. And the other part, and I forget whether you and I have talked about this, but I think we fail to recognize fear a lot of times. I think a lot of and I see different ways people respond to fear, and I'm certainly not claiming it's always one way or the other, but I find that most common responses to fear, at least in my experience, are anger and sadness. And I'm prone to anger because makes me feel empowered, however illusory that is. And there are other people in my life that are very close to me. They respond with sadness. They feel hopeless and sad, and being angry is so uncomfortable for them that sad is an easier place for them to go. And so I find if I find myself being angry or sad, I need to pay attention.
Oh, excellent points. That's why I love talking to you, because you come from such a learned perspective on this. It's interesting. Because part of what I try to do for mediators and lawyers as well as leaders is to help them understand, some of the distorted thinking that we might have, but also what are some of the triggers that may not be rooted in the present, oftentimes rooted in the past, but come up. And so your emphasis on helplessness is right on, and that is one of the 10 triggers to a fear-based mindset or emotional reaction. And so I provide some tips in my video series on what to look for, and you gave an excellent illustration of some of the physical aspects of how you might respond with conflict. And so I've broken it down into different emotions for each of the 10 triggers so that we understand what might be going on. We can frame our questions around it, but then also how do we redirect that to a healthier, more productive place so that we can actually work towards reaching some closure or resolution about conflict.
Well, and I think that the resolution piece has come to mean something different for me, and I guess that's because almost all of my mediations are in a litigated setting, and we call it alternative dispute resolution, ADR, and we mediate cases to resolve them. But for me, at least, resolution is a much bigger word than that. What I find that what we do is we provide legal closure. If there's a lawsuit and somebody sued somebody else, we can keep them from dueling in the streets if we reach an agreement, or if they take it to trial and a judge or a jury decides. But resolution has a more global, almost existential kind of meaning for me. And I find it's not just true in litigated settings. It might be true if you and I have an argument. And we disagree on things, and we've decided we're going to have this conversation, but we really haven't ultimately agreed to the underpinnings of it all, but we want the relationship to go on, or we may have to work together. But that resolution piece happens maybe when I start to go to sleep that night and I can't sleep, or I get up the next morning after a night's sleep and I have a cup of coffee and maybe I'm thinking a little bit better. And because I'm not as scared, not as afraid, and I'm not as defensive, I can say, oh, this may be what Deborah meant. And I give you the benefit of the doubt that I'm perhaps too afraid to do in the heat of that moment. And among the most important, helpful tools for me, and this kind of is just a global perspective, is I believe everybody wakes up in the morning and gives life their best shot. I really believe that. And I believe their best shot is just no damn good sometimes. And that is true for me too. And I was watching the Chicago Cubs play the other night, and I'm a Cubs fan. And one of the outfielders dropped the ball in what seemed like a routine catch. And the game ended not the way I would have liked it to end. And I heard all this vitriol poured out and all these things. I'm thinking, here is somebody who's among the most skilled players in the entire world at what he does. I'm sure he didn't intend that. He did the best he could, and he fell short. And I think, again, most of us don't have the audience that a professional baseball player has or that a movie star has. But in those moments, sometimes when people are most irritating to me, I think, golly, they're doing the best they can. And today theirs is no good. Maybe that'll be tomorrow. And what can I do not to aggravate it? What can I do not to make theirs worse?
I think thank you for elaborating, as far as the distinction between resolution and closure. I hadn't thought about it in that kind of way before. And so for you really see, the mediation process as bringing closure to the dispute or conflict, right? But resolution manifests in a much bigger way. Yeah.
And I'll give you an example. A lot of the cases I do involve catastrophic injuries or large companies that have had things go horribly wrong and people are going to be losing their jobs, or maybe the whole company is going to close. We may end whatever the dispute is right there, that legal part of it. But if somebody has lost a child in a horrible accident, we're not resolving that. That loss is real and present and will be. And it's why, sometimes when people are grieving, we will hear people say, and perhaps I've said to somebody, well, you'll get through it, or this will end, or you would feel differently. And what I found is, one, I don't have a right to say that to anybody. And two, I don't think we get over these things that have really wounded us, maybe ever completely, but we learn to carry them differently. And sometimes I may carry them like a weight that's drawing me down to the bottom of the ocean. And other times it may be light enough that I can come out from the pit and see there is daylight, and there might be somebody dancing over there, and I can appreciate that. I may go back into the pit, but the way I carry that, I tend to learn over time. I don't just suddenly, the lawsuit ends or my argument with you ends. Okay, and now it's all okay. I'm happy, joyous, and free. That tends to be a longer and individual process.
Yeah. Well, and in my world, we might refer to them as emotional hangovers.
Yes.
And it takes a while to recover from those, depending upon the significance of whatever the trauma. And we know and understand trauma so much better than we used to choose, that there are little traumas and there are big traumas, and what might be traumatic for you may not be traumatic for me. And that's why it's just so important, that we take time to, listen and learn where the other person's coming from, because regardless, they have some emotion about it. They feel strongly about it. But that goes back to the title of what you said, being right is way overrated and very expensive, or something like that, and because we can prolong the pain of whatever the dispute is over, by insisting that we're right, or our way of looking at things is the best way to look at things.
Well, and even it may not even be about the substance of the dispute, but even the process. For instance, there are times where I so dislike a prolonged decision-making process. I'd rather make a less optimal decision and not have the frustration over the next 2 weeks and just say, I'll live with it and not regret it, than spend 2 weeks patiently sorting through everything until we get to what may be a better decision. Where I have other people that are important in my life that I work with and that I live with who are much more deliberative. And they say, I know this is frustrating, but I want to be sure that I've done everything I can to make sure that I've made the best decision possible. Well, one is not necessarily better than the other. With the benefit of hindsight, we may say, wow, this is a better decision, or that was a better decision. But none of us ever have all the variables to know what was the best decision, no matter what. And most of them are somewhat nuanced anyway. And I find even that process can lead me to want to discount what you're saying to me, not just because of the substance of it, because I don't like the way you're telling it to me. I don't like the way you may have a much more relaxed, deliberative approach with more silences, and I want to fill the silence. Well, that doesn't mean it's right. In fact, I may hurt the process for both of us by me not being willing to say, okay, I've got to dig my fingers into my thighs a little bit and just sit here and be quiet till you process the way you most like to process.
Yes, in processing time is different for different people too. Some of us are very adept at making, sizing things up and sort of analyzing information quickly and making a decision. Well, that can be both positive and not so positive, because sometimes we can make decisions too quickly and not allow time to, as you said, pause or park. And then other times, people, well, again, I go back to communication styles. One particular style, would rather never resolve the conflict because it's so painful for them. And so they need more time to process, but that's almost the problem too, is that they take too much time and other people have moved on. And, done deal, and yeah.
Well, and I think and you use the term owning, I think owning what our style is, and that if somebody has a style different than mine, I am going to find that less comfortable for me. And yet I can still engage with it. I like what Simone Weil, they said, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. And if I'm really paying attention, and as you pointed to our heads earlier, it's not just being quiet. It's doing the best I can to set it aside. And I call it radical listening. If I listen radically, it's not just active listening, is I am listening in a way that I'm setting aside the certainty I may have that I'm right. I'm being open to the possibility I might be wrong, to that 1% chance, whatever it might be. And I find there is nothing I had a friend tell me one time, the only thing you're ever certain about is your first marriage. And I think with the way it plays out, many of us are young when we first get married, and then they think, wow, this, whatever. But I think if I can set aside certainty, that's so important to me. I mean, my demand for certainty, because I sometimes demand certainty in places that it's not possible. And that illusion leads me to make bad decisions or respond in ways that aren't helpful precisely because of that fear. I think I'm only going to be okay if there's one outcome. When we find whether it's you didn't get into the school you wanted to, or you didn't make the band, or you didn't get the job, and people with enough wear on their tires, they don't have to be as old as I am, have usually found a circumstance where they didn't get what they want, and they still find the circumstance may not be what they want, but they are still okay. They may redefine that. They may learn some different things. They may just suffer because of it. But there is not just one set of outcomes which makes us okay or not, I believe.
That's a good point. Yes. And again, I go back to, it's important to be aware and examine different perspectives of looking at the same thing. And I know I have this little exercise I take people through called the 360-degree perspective. You and I could be looking at the same thing, but we're going to see different things just because we are different. Yeah. And so apologize for that. A little bit of a ring coming in. We'll go ahead and cut that. I'll make a note of that. And that's why, I'm arguing from a position becomes such a futile exercise. And like you said before, is, we can get even more intense about that. But instead saying, well, okay, you see things differently. I see things differently. Let's talk about what we see similarly and what we see differently, because now we can focus on what we see differently and determine, do we really need to reach some mutual, resolution about that, or mutual closure about that? Or is it okay that we just see things differently?
Well, and I think it's not just that you may see it differently from the way I see it. You and I may see it differently ourselves at different times. I've got a friend who's he was giving a talk one time, and he said, they say you can't change your past, but in some ways you're changing your past every time you retell a story. You tell the story 2 weeks later to a different audience, and the different audience may just be a different person you're having coffee with, and you focus on one detail or another, or you remember something that you forgot, or you forgot something that you remembered, and you're changing the whole tenor of what the meaning of that story is based on the audience, or just how you remembered, or what you may have gone through the day before. And so that same story, that we may see a video that looks exactly the same, but how we interpret it, how we feel it, and how we share it becomes something completely different. If I can remember that, then it's easier for me to remember that you may see it in present time, in real time, differently than I do.
Yes. And I was thinking about, how do people, decide to engage in conflict? And I think that goes back to what you were saying earlier, is it worth it? And what was the second one again?
Is it safe?
Is it safe? Yes. Yeah.
Well, and the safety piece, I think, can also mean different things to different people. There are people that have suffered traumas in their lives where something may be unsafe for them, and it would feel more safe to me. And I want to be careful, at least, about judging other people's safety or deciding you owe it to me to engage in this conflict. Mm-hmm. Or some people, the way they engage in conflict is they need to wait and think about it and come back in a week. That when they're in the midst of it, that's not the way they can do it. Somebody else just wants to get over it. So they try to draw them in almost with claws to bring them into their embrace to have the conversation. And I think all those things are important. And sometimes I may not realize it's unsafe till I get in the middle of it and it moves beyond discomfort. And I say, wow, I'm responding so badly that, like the time I said, I'm too defensive. I can't respond right now. I think it's important, and I'm willing to come back to this conversation. But right now, I'm afraid I might do something to make this worse. Right.
And that's why I enjoy bringing the neuroscience of how our brains function, because, we know that when we're triggered, trying to stay in those triggering moments is really not the best place to be, because we're likely to say and do things that are hurtful, harmful, and damaging. But instead, our brain actually functions better just from a chemical standpoint. We get the adrenaline going, then we get the cortisol going. It takes a few hours for that to settle back down so we can think more logically, more reasonably. And as I oftentimes will share with my teachings, is that sometimes that we benefit from 24 to 72 hours. Don't make important decisions without giving that span of time, because we need to take into need to take into consideration information that may not be present to us in the immediate moment. And then sometimes even up to 2 weeks. But again, there's got to be a conversation around that.
And I think that's difficult when things are highly charged and you're bringing everybody in together to do it. And Daniel Kahneman talks about the focusing illusion. Nothing's so important as when we're thinking about it. And one of the examples he gives is somebody that has been in a horrible accident and become a paraplegic. Well, right after that accident happens, they're going through rehab and having to reorient themselves to their image of who they are and what they can do and what they cannot do. There's a period where they're deeply depressed and they're scared and all those things. And it's not that immediately goes away, but 2 years from then, they still have that same physical effect from that accident. But if they're sitting in a bar watching a ball game and having a beer with friends, they're enjoying it every bit as much as everybody else. None of that loss of their use of their limbs has changed, but they're not focusing on it because they're focused on other things. And I'm not saying that as, boy, somebody just needs to think about something else in the middle of their trauma. I don't mean that at all. But there are things that over time we can benefit from, whether it's 24 hours or 72 hours. And it's one of the things that I find we lawyers are not particularly good at, because we think, boy, the judge has given us an hour and a half for this hearing. I got to get all my arguments in there and I've got to state everything that needs to be stated. And we will forget that in the midst of that, I may miss something that I should have heard, or I may not say something that was most important to me in the middle of those constraints, because we don't get the 72 hours. And that's hard.
Right.
It's just hard.
Right. Yeah. So it's really important to think about what are the salient points I do need to make, and what are other things that I might want to say, but really aren't necessary to say in whatever time span we have. I'm thinking about that just in light of having done my first TEDx talk, and you get
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. You get 10 minutes, and like you, I'm an active speaker, so there's a lot of things I could talk all day long on, if I'm given the time. But when you have 10 minutes, it was a challenge to really say, okay, what's my topic and what are the most important things I want to say about this, still be able to share a story or two and engage my audience. And so that was a really a big challenge. And but I learned so much through it. And it's helped me in many other ways. And so even approaching mediation, for example, people in conflict. Yeah.
It is my belief that all of us need a good editor to follow us around 24 hours a day, because it's not just for TEDx talks. I think about that one point I wanted to continue to make. And there's some people that have done some research on arguments. And again, this goes back to not just lawyers, but anybody making a presentation that wants to call some kind of a response from their audience. And we'll kind of make our arguments from the strongest down to the weakest. And we may have 6 of them. And what they've found in the terms of the way people listen to those arguments, they don't weight them from top to bottom. They add them together and average them. So there's even a bigger strategic decision we have to make if we're trying to get somebody to consider change. I'm not arguing that we get to make people change, which is, I have 6 points. But golly, maybe I want to talk about my top 3, because those bottom 3 are not as strong. And if the people hear that, they will not just hear 6 points, they'll hear 6 points and they'll average them rather than think of the strength of those top 3. And for people who are talkers, or people who are speakers, or people that just use too many words, as I often do, recognizing this, I need my editor today. This is the point I really want to make. Most of us aren't going to remember what other people tell us anyway. So if there's one thing, am I willing to say, this is the one thing I really would like you to know, and just sit there and shut up? Not my strength.
Yeah. Well, I will put some science behind that too, because, again, our brain, you illustrated it perfectly, is that, just trying to say one thing, our brains, they talk about, remembering up to 7 or 9 things. It's like, actually most people, once you get to 5, they can remember maybe 3 or 4, but then they'll usually forget that 5th thing. And the same goes for 2 or 3. So our brains actually focus best when we focus on 1, 2, or 3 points. And people will usually then remember 2 out of the 3, not necessarily the 3rd one. And so, they always say, less is more. And so that illustrates that very well. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I'm curious, as we wind up, I want to know if you have, some, if people do decide to engage in conflict, what are some practical tools that you can suggest for how they consider or approach it or engage in it?
Well, I start with Park because that's kind of a global response, because it starts with recognizing the physical changes in me that tell me I'm just not uncomfortable unless I have the flu. There's something going on. I've got some kind of a conflict. There's the way I think the world should be, and it's not that way, whether it's something you've said or somebody else has said, or a life circumstance. So I want to think about that in Park. But there are three things specifically with regard to conflict I think are important. And one is to embrace the discomfort of it. At least in my experience, pain-free conflict is what I call option F, which is fantasy. So one, embrace the conflict. Two is to radically listen, because there is no conflict without me, right? I mean, if we have a conflict and I say, I'm just willing to give up the conflict, you're right, Deborah, let's do it your way, the conflict is over. So I want to radically listen for that. And the third one kind of ties into that, which is I want to accept my part of it, whatever that part is. I want to, because there is no conflict without me, I've got to at least be part of it. If I walk away from it or decide it's not important enough to have it, or it's not safe, there is no more any conflict. So embrace discomfort, radically listen, which is being open to the possibility that I'm wrong, and accept responsibility for my part in it.
Yeah.
And I may misgauge that. It may be that I learn some things when I talk to you afterwards and tell you what went on and say, boy, Sam, I think you really missed that. But those three I find to be enormously helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent points. Excellent points. Yes. I know I was working with a couple in this situation the other day, and the gentleman was just so focused on, I need to understand why she did this. It's like, well, that's probably the $1 million question that I'll never get answered, Instead say, okay, what are some of the factors that might have contributed to this? And to help him look at it a little bit differently. So I like what you talk about. Yeah, it is uncomfortable. And are you really listening? Well, she said that, but I didn't really pay attention, or I didn't believe her. It's like, well, that's probably problem number one, and then of course accepting your part of it. Yeah.
Well, and that situation, I've changed my view of understanding as well. I think it is, the effort to understand has great value. But unless I'm really living in your shoes, I may never experience that exactly the way you experience it. And so the way I think about it is, acceptance is a choice and understanding is a gift. If I really do come to understand it, then that's great. But I want to accept that you feel that way, whether I understand it or not. And I'm not necessarily entitled to the reasons why. And if I ask you for an explanation, you may try to give it to me very honestly, and you may or may not be right, because there's so many things that are part of who we are over our years on this earth. And I think it's really, which is why I encourage people never to say you need to understand, you have to understand, or you should understand, because I think those are gifts, and I don't get to demand it of anybody else.
Right. That's again excellent points. In this particular conflict that I was trying to help mediate, from her perspective, she goes, I've tried to explain to him what was going on for me. He doesn't believe me. And so that was another thing, not accepting where someone was coming from, and whether or not you understand it, but accepting where people were coming from. Again, you may not agree with what or why and how they did things, but at the same time, it's happened, and we can't change what's happened. We can only, grasp an understanding of it now, so we can move forward differently.
Yeah, or stay in the middle of the conflict, in which case the same thing will happen again and again and again. I mean, we've all lived that insanity.
Yes, we have. Well, yeah. What's Einstein saying about sanity?
Doing the same thing and expecting different results.
There we go. Thank you so much. Yes, I was just blanked on that. I could hear the word of sanity, but couldn't figure the rest of it out. So, good example of how we can't remember everything that's presented to us, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Any quick or final piece of advice, Sam, that you'd want to pass on? I know you gave us 3 excellent tips, some great sayings.
Yeah, I would say the time, this is a quote from a Mortal's book, Rules of Civility. And he says, in times of high emotion, if the next thing you're about to say makes you feel better, it's probably the wrong thing to say.
I love that. That sort of ties back to not everything that pops into your head needs to come out of your mouth.
Absolutely. And I talk about a lot of these in my book. That's kind of in the background here, Positively Conflicted. So if somebody wants to read more about it, they can do that, or send me an email.
Well, you must have been reading my mind, because I was just going to ask, please share with us your book, because I did read it after hearing you speak at the National Academy of Dispute Neutrals last year in Atlanta. And first I loved your presentation. And so I had to get your book and really enjoyed reading that. So what would you say, when you talk about positively conflicted, to maybe intrigue our viewers and listeners to rush out and get it, what would you say is one key takeaway or key benefit that people will glean?
Well, the first chapter is called The Storm Inside, and there's a very brief exercise I encourage people to do to examine internal conflict. We tend to think about conflict as conflict with other people. And an example I often use with people is when the alarm goes off in the morning and you've been up too late the night before, you've got a conflict. Am I going to call in and make an excuse at work and stay under the covers that feels so good on a cold winter morning? Or am I going to get up in the discomfort of taking a shower and my head's banging or whatever else and show up at the meeting I'm supposed to go to? So those little conflicts are happening all the time. And if we pay attention to those, we can get better at the big ones.
Ah, very good. Excellent advice. So positively conflicted, right? There we go.
Right.
Yeah, by Sam Ardery. Great. So do get it. It really is a great read. So thank you so much, Sam, for being with me on Decoding the Conflict Mindset. Contributed so much. I've been busy writing notes.
Well, it's truly been my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Deborah.
Well, thank you. Well, viewers and listeners, you heard it here. This is recorded, of course, and so do pass it on and subscribe to Decoding the Conflict Mindset so that you are notified for each and every wonderful guest speaker that we have here on our program. And so subscribe now, come back and visit us in 2 more weeks. We'll have another excellent speaker coming up. You'll learn more in just a few minutes. Take care. Well, I sure hope that you enjoyed the conversation with Sam Ardery and learning about his book, Positively Conflicted, and how to look at conflict differently. I particularly enjoyed his use of the acronym PARC, P-A-R-C. If you missed that, go back and listen. Well, our next guest coming up is somebody I met just recently, a fellow mediator from the state of Indiana, Matthew Carroll. And what's so unique about Matthew is that he entered into the world of negotiation and conflict resolution mediation relatively later in life. He actually was a performing arts singer throughout the world. But he was also involved in negotiations on behalf of his performing arts union. Well, that led to a whole other world, and now he is a full-time mediator. However, still sings once in a while. You'll have to listen to the podcast coming up in just 2 weeks to find out where he still sings and then how he mediates. I'm Dr. Deborah Dupri, the Mindset Doc. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.